In June of 2024, in the holy city of Mecca, something happened that scientists had long warned was coming, and that a great many of them had quietly hoped was still years, or even decades, away, over the course of just a few days, as more than 1.5 million pilgrims gathered together for the Hajj. The temperature climbed past 50 degrees Celsius, and the air itself grew thick and heavy and humid. And the combination of that ferocious heat and that rising humidity finally crossed an invisible line, the precise line beyond which the human body can no longer cool itself down at all, and simply begins, quietly, to fail. By the end of it, more than 1,300 people were dead. Not from a storm, or a flood, or a fire, or any disaster that you could actually see, but from the very air itself, from temperatures that the human body, quite simply, cannot survive. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to. And it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. To really understand what happened there in Mecca, and why it stands as such a stark warning for so much of the wider Middle East, you first have to understand something genuinely crucial, and honestly a little bit frightening, about the human body itself. Because your body absolutely has to hold its own internal temperature, almost perfectly steady, right around 37 degrees Celsius. And whenever it starts to get too hot, it has one single, truly powerful tool for cooling itself back down: sweat. As that sweat evaporates off the surface of your skin, it carries away heat along with it, cooling you down. But, and this is the absolutely critical part, that entire system only actually works if the surrounding air is dry enough to soak up the moisture in the first place. When the air outside is already thick and saturated with humidity, your sweat simply cannot evaporate anymore. And when your sweat can no longer evaporate, your body's one great cooling system fails completely, and at that point, it truly does not matter how much water you drink or how hard you try to rest in the shade. Your core temperature begins to climb relentlessly, and if it climbs too high for too long, your vital organs begin to shut down, one after another. This right here is the reason that a humid heat can kill a person at temperatures that a dry heat never possibly could. And it is worth understanding what that failure actually looks like inside a body, because it is a genuinely brutal process. It usually begins with heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, dizziness, weakness, a pounding heart, and nausea as the body strains ever harder to cool itself. But if the core temperature keeps on climbing, past around 40 degrees Celsius, it tips over into full heat stroke. And this is where it becomes truly deadly. The body's own internal cooling and regulation systems break down entirely. The person may become confused or delirious and can lose consciousness. And then, as the internal organs literally begin to overheat, they start to fail: the kidneys, the liver, the heart, the brain itself. In the most severe cases, the body's proteins and tissues begin, in effect, to cook. Without rapid, aggressive cooling, heat stroke can kill within hours. And in the crushing heat and dense crowds of a place like Mecca, that rapid cooling was, for far too many people, simply not available in time. Now, scientists actually measure this specific deadly combination of heat and humidity together using something they call the wet bulb temperature. And for a very long time, the accepted wisdom was that the absolute ultimate limit of human survival sat at a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, a theoretical point beyond which even a perfectly fit and healthy person, resting completely in the shade with all the water they could want, would still die within a matter of hours. But here, now, is the crucial and the genuinely alarming update to all of this. Because recent real-world research, actually testing real human beings under controlled conditions, has now found that the true limit is in fact significantly lower than that old figure. It sits closer to a wet bulb temperature of just 31 degrees for young and healthy people doing even light activity. And for the elderly, or the sick, or for anyone at all exerting themselves out under the sun, that limit is lower still. In other words, the real danger zone begins far, far earlier than we used to believe. And that single revision is exactly what makes what unfolded in Mecca so profoundly important. And I'm genuinely curious as we go. Before today, had you ever heard of the wet bulb limit, this point where the human body simply can't cool itself? Let me know down in the comments. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. Because during the 2024 Hajj, the wet bulb temperature did not actually reach that old famous limit of 35 degrees at all. It peaked at somewhere around 29.5 degrees. And yet, even so, over the 6 days of the pilgrimage, researchers later found that the true limits of human heat tolerance had been breached for a genuinely staggering 43 hours in total. For the older, more vulnerable pilgrims, those survival limits were exceeded on every single one of the 6 days of the Hajj. And on the single most ferocious day of all, the combined heat and humidity climbed clear past the survivability threshold, even for young, fit, and healthy adults, for around 4 straight hours. The line, quite simply, had been crossed. And so, people began to die. The final toll was utterly devastating. More than 1,300 pilgrims lost their lives, and there were over 2,700 reported cases of serious heat illness on just a single day of the pilgrimage. At the Grand Mosque itself, in the very heart of Mecca, the temperature was recorded as climbing as high as 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is very nearly 125 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. And the human scale of it reached right across the world. The dead came from many different countries. Egypt alone lost more than 600 of its citizens, with dozens more from Jordan and Indonesia and India and Pakistan and beyond, in the worst days. Videos shared online showed bodies lying in the streets around the Grand Mosque, overcome where they fell. Many of the dead were buried in Mecca itself, according to custom and the wishes of their families, while, far away in their home countries, relatives waited in anguish for word of loved ones who had set out on the journey of a lifetime and would never return from it. It was a tragedy measured not only in a single shocking number, but in more than 1,000 separate families, scattered across the globe, each left to grieve. And the Hajj, tragically, is almost perfectly designed to be vulnerable to exactly this kind of catastrophe, because it is a pilgrimage that takes place very largely outdoors, out under the open, unshaded sky. The pilgrims are required to walk between 6 and 21 kilometers on each and every day. They must stand for many long hours in open-air prayer. And, critically, nearly half of all the pilgrims who make the journey are over the age of 56, and around half of them have some kind of pre-existing health condition, which makes them precisely and tragically the very people who are most vulnerable of all to extreme heat. Now add to all of that the enormous, dense, pressing crowds and the sheer physical exhaustion of the rites themselves, and you have a genuine recipe for disaster the moment that the temperature truly begins to soar. But perhaps the single most heartbreaking part of this entire story is the question of who, exactly, it was that died. Because a huge share of the victims, by some accounts, well over 80% of them, were what are known as unregistered pilgrims. You see, the Hajj officially requires a special permit, one that can be extremely expensive to obtain. And so, every single year, hundreds of thousands of people who simply cannot afford that permit make the sacred pilgrimage anyway, through unofficial and irregular channels. But without that official permit, they find themselves shut out of the very things that might have saved their lives in the heat, the air-conditioned tents, the cooled buses, the organized shade, and the official medical support. So while the wealthier registered pilgrims were largely able to retreat into air conditioning during the very worst of the heat, the poorest pilgrims of all were left out there, to walk and to stand and even to sleep, exposed under the full desert sun. And it was they who, overwhelmingly, paid the ultimate price. It is a stark and a genuinely sobering glimpse of a future in which extreme heat becomes, more and more, a killer that quietly sorts its victims by their wealth. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely important, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. So why is it that the Middle East, in particular, finds itself right on the front line of all this? Well, part of the answer is simply down to geography, because much of the region is, of course, blisteringly hot desert to begin with. But the truly, uniquely dangerous part actually comes along its coastlines, along the shores of the Persian Gulf and of the Red Sea, because these happen to be shallow and increasingly warm bodies of water, and they pump absolutely enormous quantities of moisture up into the air above them, which means that the great coastal cities of the Gulf end up getting the very worst of both worlds. All at the very same time, the extreme, searing, baking heat of the open desert, combined with the thick, heavy, suffocating humidity rolling in off that warm sea. And it is precisely that combination, very high heat and very high humidity, together at once, that drives the wet bulb temperature climbing up toward the deadly zone. And it is not only along the humid coasts that the region breaks records. Out in the drier interior, the Middle East regularly posts some of the highest air temperatures ever reliably measured anywhere on the planet. Kuwait has recorded temperatures of around 54 degrees Celsius, that is roughly 129 degrees Fahrenheit, among the very hottest ever registered on Earth. Parts of Iraq and Iran routinely bake past 50 degrees in the height of summer. And in the Iranian city of Avaz, a combination of blistering heat and rising humidity once pushed the heat index, which is how hot it actually feels to the human body, to an almost unimaginable level, well beyond 70 degrees Celsius. These are numbers that, not so very long ago, would have seemed almost impossible for a place where millions of people actually live and work. And across the region, they are becoming less and less remarkable with every passing summer. And all of it is now getting worse, and getting worse quickly. The Middle East, as a whole, is currently warming at nearly twice the global average rate. And right across the entire world, those periods of dangerous, extreme, humid heat have already more than doubled in their frequency since 1979. And the scientists who carefully studied the Mecca disaster came away with a genuinely chilling conclusion that in a steadily warming climate, deadly heat events exactly like the one in 2024 may soon cease to be a rare and shocking tragedy at all, and may instead become a regular and an expected occurrence. And there is a particular cruelty to the timing of the Hajj too, because its date is set by the Islamic lunar calendar, which is shorter than the standard solar year. The pilgrimage slowly drifts backward through the seasons over time, spending a run of years falling squarely within the brutal peak of the Saudi summer, exactly as it does now. Which means this is not a one-off danger that will simply pass with the next cool season. For a stretch of years to come, the Hajj is destined to keep landing in the very hottest, most dangerous part of the year, placing well over 1 million people, many of them elderly, out under that punishing sun. Again and again. Saudi authorities are acutely aware of this, and are pouring resources into cooling the pilgrimage, expanding shaded areas, misting systems, and cooled spaces along the routes. But the sheer scale of the event and the sheer intensity of the heat make it an immense challenge, and the Hajj, as utterly devastating as it was, is really only the most visible face of a much larger and a much quieter crisis that now unfolds right across the region every single summer. Consider, for a moment, the millions of outdoor laborers, a great many of them migrant workers, drawn from poorer countries who physically build and clean and maintain the gleaming, modern cities of the Gulf. For those workers, laboring through the long summer months means toiling in temperatures that can be genuinely and quietly lethal. In fact, right across the Gulf states, governments have now been forced to impose outright bans on all outdoor work during the middle hours of the day throughout the hottest part of the year, specifically and explicitly to try to stop their workers from simply collapsing and dying out in the heat. And then, of course, there is the near total and the almost absolute dependence on air conditioning, because the modern air-conditioned city has in a very real and literal sense been the one thing that made the Gulf livable at all, allowing many millions of people to comfortably inhabit places that would otherwise sit at the very furthest edge of human tolerance for months on end. But that hard-won safety comes bundled together with a hidden and a genuinely profound fragility, because in a place where the outdoor temperature can readily hit 50 degrees Celsius, Air conditioning is no longer a mere luxury or a comfort. It has quietly become a form of life support. And that, in turn, means that these entire societies are now utterly and completely dependent on a constant and an absolutely uninterrupted supply of electricity. A long and sustained power failure, striking during the very peak of a summer heat wave in a great city that has been built entirely around air conditioning, would not merely be uncomfortable or inconvenient. It could, very rapidly indeed, tip over into a genuine mass casualty catastrophe. And all of this leads, in the end, to perhaps the single most profound and unsettling question of them all. Because if parts of the Middle East are already, right now, briefly touching the absolute limits of human survivability, and if those deadly events are truly set to become both more frequent and more severe with every passing decade, then what, exactly? Does the long-term future actually hold for the region? Some scientists have now openly warned that without dramatic and sustained action to curb the warming of the planet, parts of the Persian Gulf could, by the latter part of this century, begin to experience heat so extreme that simply being outdoors for even a few short hours at certain times of the year would become genuinely lethal. And that forces us to confront a genuinely staggering possibility. Could parts of one of the most heavily populated and most strategically important regions on the entire face of the Earth slowly become, for at least part of every year, very nearly uninhabitable to the unprotected human body? So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, and this is genuinely important, that phrase, temperatures the human body cannot survive, is real and it is accurate, but it absolutely has to be understood correctly. It does not mean that everyone across the Middle East is somehow about to suddenly drop dead, nor that the very instant the temperature ticks across some magic line, people simply perish on the spot. What it means is something far more specific than that. It means that, for certain hours, in certain places, the combination of the heat and the humidity climbs beyond the point at which the human body is able to keep itself cool, and that prolonged, unprotected exposure during those particular windows, especially for the old, the sick, the very young, and for those who are working or worshiping out in the open, becomes genuinely deadly. A healthy person, indoors, with functioning air conditioning and plenty of water, is generally going to be safe. The real mortal danger falls, overwhelmingly, upon the exposed and upon the vulnerable. Second, and quite crucially, the Mecca tragedy was very far from being a purely natural, and therefore unavoidable, disaster. It was, in enormous part, a disaster of inequality and of preparation. The wealthy pilgrims, with their access to air conditioning, very largely survived it. The poor, unregistered ones, left out in the sun, very largely did not. And that means that a great deal of this suffering is, at least in principle, genuinely preventable through better protection and cooling infrastructure, and shade and water and sensible restrictions on outdoor exposure, and, above all, through access to all of those things for absolutely everyone, and not merely for the well-off. And third, the region itself is very far from being helpless in the face of all this. Saudi Arabia, for its part, has been steadily expanding its cooling stations, and its misting systems, and its shaded walkways, and its emergency medical support for the Hajj. And the Gulf states, more broadly, are now investing very heavily indeed in cooling and in adaptation. The danger is undeniably real, and it is undeniably rising, but so too is the sheer scale of the effort now being mounted to try to meet it. But the underlying reality of it all still remains deeply and genuinely sobering. Because for very nearly the first time in all of recorded human history, human beings are now beginning to regularly encounter, out in the open air of a major, populated region of the world, temperatures that press directly up against the absolute physical limits of what our bodies ever evolved to be able to endure. Mecca, in the summer of 2024, was not some strange, freak, one-off event. It was a preview, and it delivered a message that the entire world would do very well indeed to hear. And to hear clearly that there is a hard ceiling to human heat tolerance, one written permanently into our very biology, and that, in a warming world, we are now beginning, for the very first time, to genuinely bump up against it. So the very next time that you happen to glance at a weather map of the Middle East in the deep blazing heart of the summer, and you see it glowing all over with those impossible angry reds and purples, and you watch a number like 50 degrees flash across the screen, I want you to understand that you are no longer simply looking at an uncomfortably hot day. You may, in fact, be looking directly at the leading edge of one of the truly defining challenges of this entire century, the growing and the deepening collision between a steadily warming planet and the fixed and utterly unchangeable limits of the human body itself. For the whole of our long history as a species, we have found ways to adapt to the climate around us, with our clothing, and our shelter, and, more recently, with the miracle of air conditioning. But there exists a point beyond which the raw and simple physics of heat and humidity together simply cannot be adapted to any longer by an exposed and unprotected human being, a point at which the very air itself becomes lethal to us. And the Middle East now has the grim distinction of being the first major region on Earth to begin brushing up against that point, out in the open. But as the whole world continues, relentlessly, to warm, it most certainly will not be the last. And what those pilgrims in Mecca were forced to face in the terrible, killing heat of June 2024 is very likely a genuine glimpse of a threshold that more and more of humanity may, in the difficult years still to come, be forced to confront for themselves.